So what happened was, so we were looking at this area when I first came on board on the 1st of October. It was something which, as the ICO kind of came through GDPR and came through all the work I had to do on the change that was GDPR, but was very much on the list. So I picked up ad tech as I came in. And then obviously, only in the first few weeks of me being there, we also received complaints from both the Brave group with Michael Veal and Johnny Ryan and that gang, and also from Privacy International. And some of you will be very familiar with those, some of you won't. If you're not familiar, then by all means go and have a little look at those. And there have been inputs into a process that we're already working on. We had a lot of bilateral engagement, by which I mean we went to lots of meetings, learnt a lot, but also realised that very often we were talking to publishers or advertisers or tech firms or smaller ad tech firms and getting told, well, we don't like this, the way that this works. And by this, by the way, we're talking about open RTB here. As the update report covers, it's not because we think everything else in the world of advertising is great. We're focused on open RTB as an area where there's a very high volume of data, and a very high volume of personal data, high rate of processing, and characteristics we find worrying. And everyone was saying, well, we don't like this, but we've got no choice to do it, and actually it's everybody else's fault. And the publishers saying, well, the ad tech firms make us do it this way, and the ad tech firms saying the publishers insist on doing it this way because of the user experience, and the advertisers saying, well, we don't like any of this, but we've got to actually get to our markets, and blah, 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 blah. So it's like, okay. So we had a one-day workshop a few months ago where we tried to get as many players in the room as possible. We're going to do another one of those in November. And then after that workshop, we produced our update report. And our update report is our summary of the issues we think we have within OpenRTB. What we did there was, and I'll list some of those issues in a second, but what we said in there was that we didn't want to actually, whilst we thought there were big issues and that current practices were not compliant, we didn't want to actually go about enforcing against individual firms now. What we wanted to do was give the industry 6 months to start working on these issues, because we understood that it was complex. We understood that we didn't understand everything as well. We've been crystal clear on this, that this is a very technical area, and we're still learning, and we're still learning now. We get that there's vulnerability and there's some reliance from some parts of the ecosystem, in particular with many publishers. And if we suddenly just turned off the tap, then that could actually lead some people in trouble. And also there are other complexities around this. So, we get that there's issues around competition. We get that, that if we sat there and took actions which might make sense purely from a GDPR point of view, it might also affect issues from a competition point of view. And we're working very closely with the CMA on their market study. If you're not aware of that, you should go and read that as well. Apologies to expand your reading list. But the CMA's market study, which is looking at digital platforms, it is a good counterpoint to the kind of work that we're doing. We're working very closely with them. The meeting I'm running off to at 11:30 is about that. And so one last thing, I'll just list the questions, then your question, list the points. In the report, we covered a lot of different areas. We highlighted that we had issues around processing special categories of data, which is categories of data like race and sexuality and the like, and how the fields that we saw within OpenRTB authorized buyers included special categories of data. Under the GDPR and under the 95 directive before it, you need explicit consent if you're processing special categories of data. We were concerned around the onward transfer of data. It feels like lots of people in this ecosystem rely on boilerplate contracts and have no idea who they're sharing the data with, and so it pings around everywhere. That doesn't happen in other industries. In other industries, if you're going to actually share personal data with somebody else, then you form a view as to whether they're the right people to share personal data with. So that's just the norm. So how does that work? And we also have other issues we were concerned about within that report, covering things such as legitimate interests, how consent is obtained for normal categories of data, those kind of areas. So go to the update report for the detail there, but that was the kind of things we said. So we're looking now to keep engaging with everybody between now and Christmas, effectively, and see where we get to in terms of industry movement. We are focusing a lot of our energies on engaging with 2 parties where we see pinch points. One is with the IAB, so IAB Europe and IAB UK, because of TCF, and via IAB Tech Lab, OpenRTB as a schema as well, and also with Google because of authorized buyers. So we're like, okay, can we get movement through working with these groups? At the same time, we're still trying to engage with the industry more widely to make sure we learn and see what's going on out there. So it's not as if it's exclusive to those two, but that's where we're focusing our efforts. So discussions like this are very helpful because we're still looking to get views on that. So I've gone on a bit there, but does that give you the sweep?
Point. You're not here to tell everyone who is best in class, just who is worst in class and who is breaking the law rather than approving everyone to be passed.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's not for us as a regulator to be saying we've built a new way to do all of this, and go ta-da, because it'll be crap. Because we're regulators, we're not professionals. You guys are the experts. So if we try and say exactly how this market should work, then that's not a clever space for us to be in. I do think it's something we can do as a regulator is to say what we think good practice is. And we'll go into lots of detail, I hope, around some of the aspects of ad tech. And it's an area where, to be crystal clear, we're still engaging, we're still learning. So I'm not going to pretend we have all the answers right now. But as we've engaged along the way, we have absolutely seen really interesting examples of good practice. And we've seen different organisations doing interesting things, including Resonance, that are different ways of going around programmatic, going around and actually engaging with audiences. So we're interested in different areas, and we do want to call out good practice, but we're not going to be able to, and we shouldn't be dictating exactly how it should work.
But I'm going to read this out because this is a quote from it. The RTB report cites, in our view, the only lawful basis for business as usual RTB processing of personal data is consent. The core functionality in RTB systems that enables this profiling, processing, and use of personal data is the audience segment. A typical user would be in hundreds of audience segments. So the question is, would you say that the consent must be demonstrated for every user in every audience segment?
So it's worth going back to basics on this. So what do we regulate as a privacy regulator, and what does the GDPR regulate? It regulates personal data that relates to living individuals. And it is clear within GDPR, it talks around things like device identifiers as being personal data. So the key question there is, are you processing data that relates to living individuals, including things like device IDs? So if you visualize data flowing through, and our focus is in RTO. In a minute, given it's about half the audience have read the report, I wonder if it's worth me stepping back a bit and just actually summarising what's in the report. Otherwise, some people are in the dark. But as we see data flow through RTB from the point of collection onwards, at the point where data is being aggregated and is being blocked up and no longer relates to people, then that's not within our scope, and we're not worried about that. What we are worried about is when data is linked to the individual and the information is being inferred and qualities are being assigned to that person, because that's a personal data profile. So we are worried about that. So that's where the line of scope is. And we're very aware that in different use cases flowing across RTB, then sometimes data is being, the data set is being enriched and it's still personal data. And then at other points, it's being aggregated and it stops being personal data. So that's where the boundary is.
There's been a wave of investment, and maybe it could be opportunism, or it's the right thing to do, by brands to partner with companies who are advising them on how to use their first-party data, their customer data. Mm-hmm. And there's been real drastic action by some of the brands, especially in the financial service industry, to stop sharing data with Facebook until they are fully clear on how that data is being used, and similarly with DMPs into programmatic advertising. Would you say that they're doing the right thing, or should they also be cognizant of this sort of waiting period as you start to digest how you're going to place this, or should brands be investing in this data infrastructure and consent management?
Brands should be addressing this now, and brands are addressing this now. And so we're still talking. I was talking at a meeting on Friday with one of the very large one, the super brands as such. I don't know the terminology in this market, but around what they were doing in this area. And one of our messages for that group, with the brands, with the advertisers, is if at what point, if a regulator says and consistently says, actually, what's going on in this market is not compliant and is illegal, at what point does it become an ethical issue for the brands? They're the ones who are funding this. And at what point do they have to say, you know what, that we need to stop engaging in this particular practice and move out? And so that's because a lot of our focus right now isn't with the brands, because obviously, you know, why did the bank rob the bank? That's where the money is. You know, where's the data? The data is, you know, publishers, ad tech primarily. But the money, the bankrolling is coming from the brands. So that is the message we're giving over to that community.
The Fashion ID case in Germany deemed that the brands to be jointly culpable with Facebook, and so is that something that you envisage coming to the UK in due course, or are we, even though they weren't directly controllers, they were joint controllers?
Yeah. I think it's in the end it's likely to come, because in the end it's a recognition that that we live in a much more complicated world now. In the old days, and like I say, when I first started in privacy, you could get the whole privacy community, everyone who really knew anything about the rules. They'd all be sitting. There wouldn't be a need for people standing on the stairs. When I started doing this in 2000, 2001, it was a very small community. And the world was simple, and you had data controllers and data processors, and most of the processing was, you know, somebody would have a data set and they'd do something with it and then pass it on to somebody else. And it was all pretty, you know, it was straightforward. We live in a much more complicated world now, and joint data controllership, where two organizations have to effectively negotiate with one another and agree respective responsibilities for what's going on, is much more common. It's a much murkier world. And that's what the Facebook case was saying. It's saying where that Facebook button is on your site, you are joint data controllers. You have to have a joint position. You can't just disclaim responsibility and pass it over to Facebook. So that notion that if you're a publisher, you're going to have to you're going to have to be more active as to what's on your site. That's coming down the road, yeah.
It's apparent that you're sort of in a due diligence phase as well as devising policy and positions on this matter, which is good, and you're working with Google and IAB, and brands are also working, I think, speaking to those partners and speaking to other partners. But the fact remains that, you know, as Rob said, retargeting constitutes a major, you know, volume of spend in programmatic advertising right now, and companies like Criteo and Quantcast, the big players in this space, if, and as we speak, consumers' data is being used for retargeting purposes without their consent in the RTB ecosystem, if brands can ascertain that is happening, should they stop their spend?
It's not for me to tell brands what to do. I think it's interesting to ask brands whether they, you know, how they work in different markets and how they work in areas where they, you know, comply with the law. And flipping it around, you know, just picking a brand at random here, to be crystal clear, but if Primark get caught out selling a £5 T-shirt that's actually made by a 6-year-old in a sweatshop in Indonesia, then, you know, then they suffer brand damage, and they try and address that, and that's not that complicated. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there are no anyone in this. Well, maybe you do have some 6-year-olds in Indonesia doing your work for you, but I doubt it. You know, maybe some 20-somethings in the Philippines doing your coding, but that's a different matter entirely. But you know, in the end, the brands have to form a view on that. And like I say, we are way down the road with this. Which is why I've limited myself to asking that question. If we say this industry isn't moving and that there's bad practices out there and it's non-compliant, then at what point does it become an advertiser issue as well? And that's just something we want to see advertisers begin to engage with. What we have seen, and so onto your question in a second, but it's is we get that actually advertisers have massive concerns around transparency anyway, but it's normally kind of commercial transparency. It's about fraud, it's about ROI, it's about those kind of things. I think there's an awful lot of overlap between those issues. And again, we're not commercial, we're regulators, but so we focus on the compliance, the privacy compliance side. But I think there is a lot of the anxiety and a lot of the issues are actually linked, and the less opaque we can make the sector, the better.
Hi, Simon. Julia Smith. So just a quick question on that. At what point does the ICO step in and do a bit of naming and shaming? Can we expect to see somebody's name in the headlines, brands' names in the headlines? Is that a route you want to go down or want to avoid?
It'll come back to, as we get towards mid-December and this 6-month period from the update report expires, that's when we're looking and saying, what have we seen? Have we seen movement in the industry? And we're right on the cusp, we're halfway through that, and we're getting great engagement, and we are beginning to understand the areas where there is some levels of agreement and some not, but those are currently just ongoing discussions, so I don't want to allude to where those things are. So we'll form a view at the end of those few months. I think one observation that I think is critical, we've heard again and again, is people said, well, one of the issues there, Simon, is what happens if we do get to, let's say we get to an area, say, well, actually, if you go by these codes and protocols, do it this way, then the ICO is comfortable with how this market's working now, and the majority of the market moves that way. What happens with the ones that aren't compliant? Because there are maybe bad actors out there. At the very least, there are actors who are not engaged in this and are hoping that they just keep doing whatever they've been doing for the last few years. And I think it's going to be incumbent on the ICO to be prepared to take action against those actors if the rest of the market moves. Because we hear again and again, well, Simon, we don't like what's going on either. We'd love to do something different, but if we didn't do this, somebody else would do it anyway, and we'd just lose market share. So we can't do anything, and that's a market failure. So we're working with a failed market right now, but if the market does move, how do we make sure that it's worth moving?
So to paraphrase, hopefully correctly, the central crux of Johnny Ryan's argument is broadcasting user IDs is a breach, so consent doesn't really matter at that point. You can't consent for a data breach. Just wondered about your view on that specific point. And then secondly, given that context, whether that's incorrect or incorrect, this time next year, will there be open RTB with user IDs in, or do we as an industry have to totally refocus? Is there a GDPR compliant way of broadcasting a user identifier in a bid request and response?
It's a great question. It is getting to one of the real nubs of this. That's what we're trying to understand, and we're looking at the industry to work out over this period. And we're not advocating the Johnny Ryan position at all. Not dispelling it either. Like I say, I think I very much admire Johnny's passion and focus on this, and I've learned stuff from talking to him. So but is that the only way to do things? Not necessarily. We do talk directly it's only a little bit in the update report, but we do say, look, there's a lot of stuff out there. I think the way we say in the update report, which is still our position, is we say there's a range of ideas out there for how to address many of these issues, and we are encouraged by the fact that whilst lots of people say, well, there is no other way to do this, Simon, and that there's lots of ideas out there, at the same time, we haven't seen anything out there which is fully mature and thought through. So there's things like Johnny Ryan discussion. There's things like Coil to protect micropayments, and now their initiative with their grants. Obviously, you've got things such as resonance, having different ways of generating revenue for publishers. There's edge computing and using the phone as the exchange. There's lots of stuff bubbling away, and we don't have a position on what the end result looks like, but we do know that something has to change from how we're doing it now.